Okay, hello, welcome to this history video on Helmsley Castle, history around us. We're just going to address some key questions as part of this revision video, just to kind of hone you in on some key ideas to tackle the different types of exam questions. So just a reminder for history around us, you need to know the key stages in development of Helmsley Castle, and the exam board will ask you questions around these 14 different areas. So it's really important that you have some ideas for each one. So what this video will do is it will just give you some ideas and some prompts for each of these different categories. So we're just going to go through each one in turn. So first off, the reasons for the location of the site within its surroundings. So for this question, you can talk about Robert de Mortain, but there is a lack of source evidence, meaning that we don't know if a castle was built there. So whilst you may mention Robert de Mortain, most of what you're going to talk about is the location of the site within its surroundings and the reason why it was located there. So of course, you're going to need to focus very much on the time period of Walter Espès and why he decided to locate his site within there. So one thing you could talk about is hunting, and Walter Espès wanting to use the surrounding landscape for hunting, and that's an absolutely crucial aspect of his early castle and also for the de Ruyss family as well. And also thinking about the actual location within Helmsley itself, so built in terms of military reasons. So the fact, for example, that it was built on a rocky outcrop overlooking the town of Helmsley, and that it could oversee as northern estates. The fact it's close to the River Rye has strong natural defensive features. There's stone, for example, there to build some of the castle out of. Also, there may well have been some ditches and earthworks there already, and we don't know that, but some historians reckon that maybe there was, so that might have been another reason for the location of the site within its surroundings. And also, personally, for Walter Espès, he had lands in the northeast in Northumberland, for which he built Wark Castle, and this was the natural location to build to control his land in Yorkshire. We know that Walter Espès had invested heavily in the local area as well, so he'd funded nearby religious houses such as at Kirkham Abbey and at Rievaulx, and we know that he went to live at Rievaulx before he died, so we can guess that this was a natural place for him to build a castle and to be able to visit places like Rievaulx and also Kirkham Abbey as well. So when and why first people created the site, again, you can talk about Robert de Mortain, but really you want to talk about Walter Espès. So you can pause this and have a little look at it, but obviously Walter Espès controlling his northern lands, obviously him using the surrounding landscape for hunting, and obviously his desire to build this for military reasons. And you can use some of the source evidence from the Battle of Standard in 1138 to reflect that Walter Espès was a military man, voiced like a trumpet. He had, limbs of unparalleled length, for example. Some of that evidence suggests that some of the reasons why he decided to build and create the site there, 1120. So if you get a question about first creating the site, whilst you can mention Robert de Mortain, we haven't got loads of evidence about him. You struggle to write a whole essay on Robert de Mortain, so you very much need to focus on Walter Espès for that one. The ways in which the site has changed over time, so you want to think about how the site itself has changed. So this requires you to just have a really good sense of knowledge of what changes happened in medieval times, that change from more military kind of buildings to domestic buildings, and just having that structure of when the main changes to the castle were made in terms of the 13th century, the 14th century. Obviously the changes with the Tudor mansion and Edward Manors, repurposing the chamber block into a Tudor mansion, and then obviously the impact of the English Civil War and how the site subsequently fell into ruin. So lots and lots of things for you to write about if you get a question about how the site has changed through time. Generally, change is a really good question for Helmsley Castle, so lots of ideas there for you to think about. This one's about how the site has been used throughout its history, so you need to think about uses. So you've got that change from military to domestic, in that early time period, so medieval to Tudor. You got the turning point of the English Civil War, so the fact that before the English Civil War, Helmsley was largely domestic, and then afterwards, obviously, it fell into disrepair and ruin. And then you've got that change in use after 1700. It becomes this romantic backdrop to Duncan Park, various uses in the 19th century, community use like pageants, the Wesleyan Sunday School, military drill, political meetings, the tennis, and then the heritage site and tourist site in the 20th century as well. And again, lots of ideas for how you can use site evidence for that. Things like the Nine Men's Morris game that's been found, another nice piece of site evidence to use, archaeological evidence in that case. Diversity of activities and people associated with its site. So you can talk about hunting in medieval times, talk about the various owners, the connections they had, maybe with like national events, Thomas de Ruyss III, for example, getting executed during the Wars of the Roses. But you can also talk about in medieval times sort of jobs for local servants, builders, craftspeople. A priest and a constable would have lived on site. By the 14th century, the sort of baronial idea of retainers, where you get more people living on site and people that are loyal to the lords of Helmsley. You've got obviously the building work in Tudor times. We've got some sources about some of the masons that are working on the Tudor mansion. You've got the fact it was garrisoned by the steward Jordan Crossland and soldiers during the English Civil War, so that's another diversity of use. You've also got Helmsley Castle after 1700, lots of diversity of use, so used for political meetings and protests, pageants, fairs, the tennis, for example, chicken run, anti-tank defences in World War II, conservation, work for unemployed labourers during the Great Depression, tourism. So you've got lots of different diversity of activities and people associated with the site. You've even got Civil War reenactments that go on nowadays to write about there as well. Reasons for changes to the site. So you might talk about how things change more in terms of military to domestic in medieval times, and that's because things like the sort of warfare is changing, or the role of a baron is changing by the 14th century. The marriage between Isabel Holcroft and Edward Manners, they wanted to make the castle even more domestic in terms of the Tudor mansion. So that would be an important one. The causation of the English Civil War and the changes that brought about. The Thomas Duncan's decision not to live in Helmsley Castle, causing it to become a romantic ruin. The sort of more emphasis in the 20th century on heritage and conservation meant that the castle's use and purpose and changed then as well. So the reason changes the site into the way it was used, there's some key ideas for that one. There's quite a lot of significant times in the site's past. Certainly Robert Ferdinand de Roos, he created the basis of the castle we see today with the building in the late 12th and early 13th century. The more domestic changes in the 14th century, the Tudor mansion. If you get a turning point question, you're only going to write about the English Civil War for that one, but there's loads and loads of different things you can think about in terms of historical significance for the site. Significance of specific features in the physical remains at the site. You could talk about the earthworks and how significant they are and how they've been a constant feature of the site, quite a unique feature. The medieval footprint, we can see the medieval footprint of the building and the key parts of the castle dating back to Robert de Ferdinand de Roos, the sort of changes in the 13th and 14th century. The Tudor mansion, it's the most intact part of the castle, so what that tells us in terms of the domestic nature of the castle and how that has remained intact, and the sort of ornamental kind of features that we can see within the Tudor mansion tell us about the wealth of the Manners family in the 16th century and Edward Manners' marriage to Isabel Holcroft. The East Tower, that again tells us the significant story of the East Tower and the English Civil War and the slighting of the castle. So you could even talk about the South Barbican and the changes that went, going from sort of more of a military to domestic role when they sort of added to the South Barbican in the 14th century. So you just need to really think about some of the significant features. But if I was going to say what are the three most significant physical remains at the site, I'd definitely say the earthworks, I'd definitely say the East Tower, and I'd definitely go for the Tudor mansion. The importance of the whole site, either locally or nationally. So obviously in medieval times, it's key to its owners locally. De Roos family were important nationally. Robert Ferdinand de Roos signed the Magna Carta. The Tudor mansion reflects how many members of the nobility and gentry built mansions or prodigy houses to show off their wealth. You've learned about that in Elizabethan times. In terms of the English Civil War, it's both important locally and nationally during the English Civil War. And then even in the 20th century, it's military use in World War II. Its importance as a conservation project and heritage project, an important building for finding out about the history of Helmsley and of Yorkshire as well, and a significant example of a castle. The typicality of the site, so you're just going to need to make sure that you're able to compare it in detail to Pickering Castle, Alnwick Castle and Scarborough Castle, and know some of the key elements of similarity and difference. The castle it's probably most similar to in terms of its history is probably Scarborough Castle, because they were both very much involved in the English Civil War. The castle it's probably least similar to is Alnwick Castle, which is very, very different in terms of its history and also what it looks like nowadays in terms of it's mostly intact. What the site reveals about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history, so we can sort of see a window into some of the different things that are important to people in medieval times in terms of showing off their knowledge of military prowess, but also the domestic changes in the 14th century. The Tudor mansion tells us about the value of Tudor owners. Again, the English Civil War kind of period tells us about the sort of military nature and the sort of the local impact, if you like, of the English Civil War on people's lives. I think the sale of the castle in 1695 shows the changing values of hereditary nobility and move towards seeing castles as a property rather than inheritance. And the fact that the Duncans did not want to live in the castle, again, shows us that the importance and significance of castles were greatly reduced by that time period, and that castles are seen as nothing more as a romantic backdrop, as something that's way in the past and not a modern thing. The use of the castle as a tennis court reveals about how historical buildings often have to adapt to everyday uses. And obviously the 20th century and 21st century tells us about the story of heritage and historical sites, and about how we pay more attention now and put more emphasis on preserving historical sites. How the physical remains may prompt questions about the past and how historians frame these as inquiries. So why the castle was built? How did the castle change? How did Helmsley link to wider national medieval history? What can we learn about the English Civil War from Helmsley? Why did people move out of the castle? Who was Helmsley Castle for? Why should we preserve the castle? So lots of different questions to think about there. How the physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions. So just think about what the castle itself has chosen to focus on. They've got big artistic interpretations on the South Barbican, the chapel, the Great Hall, the Tudor Mansion. Other areas to focus on would be the East Tower and the era of the English Civil War for an artistic interpretation. And then finally, the challenges and benefits of studying a historic environment. It's always difficult to construct a picture beyond the remains with Helmsley because there are a limited number of sources on the castle, and it makes it quite a challenge to find out everything about the castle. But the benefits of studying the castles are that it gives us a really good insight into the type of life that England lived under at different points in its history, the need to fight against Northern Scots in this area, the need to display wealth through property, the romanticising of medieval remains, as we saw with what happened after 1700 and when Helmsley Castle became the romantic backdrop. Another benefit is that castles can extend our imagination. We can think and can learn very specific information about our local history, can prompt us to have our own historical questions about a historic environment. And as the site has been fairly well preserved, it makes a real site study really interesting and accessible. And as we go around the site, we can understand, and the site can richly unveil to us the history of Helmsley Castle. So that just gives you a few ideas for how you might approach some of the different types of questions. And one revision activity you might want to do is sort of take some of those different ideas and think about how you could turn them into exam questions, or maybe make notes on some of those things in a bit more depth and detail to help you with your revision. Okay, thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.